Let me tell you a story about a woman so feared, so respected, and so ruthless that Wall Street itself trembled at her name. A woman who defied the norms of her times, possessing a fortune that made millionaires look like beggars. This is the tale of Hetty Green, the richest woman in America and one of the most notorious. But Hetty wasn't born into luxury. Oh no. She clawed her way up with a sharp mind, a relentless heart, and an iron grip on every dollar she ever touched. Some called her a miser. Others called her a genius. But all agreed she was unlike any woman who had come before her. This is the remarkable life of Hetty Green, the Wall Street witch. Henrietta Howland Robinson Green was born in New Bedford, Massachusetts in 1834 into a family dripping with old whaling money. Gideon Kirby Howland, her grandfather, was part of a broader whaling company owned by the Howland family. His daughter was Abby Howland, who gave birth to Henrietta Robinson. Hetty was her parents' only surviving child, and she was sent to live with her grandparents when she was 2 years old. The Howland family was one of the richest in the whaling industry. The Howland family financed whaling voyages, which were high risk with potential for high rewards. Gideon was a merchant and an agent for the family company. They were a prominent Quaker family in New Bedford. Young Hetty was surrounded by wealth. But unlike other little girls of high society who learned needlework and etiquette, Hetty was different. By the age of 6, she was reading financial reports to her blind grandfather, absorbing the world of stocks, investments, and money like a sponge. At age 8, Hetty opened up her first bank account. By age 13, she was handling the family's books, and by age 15, she knew more about high finance than most grown men on Wall Street. It was clear early on that Hetty was not just another wealthy little girl waiting to marry a rich man. She had her own ambitions, ones that would shake the very foundation of the American financial system. When Hetty's father died in 1865, she expected a massive fortune. But what she received was a legal fight. Her father's fortune was left in a trust, and Hetty felt betrayed. How could a woman possibly handle such money? They tried to cut her out of the will. Hetty was furious and fought back. She forged the will, got caught, and sued her family anyways. Although she didn't win the entire fortune, she did inherit about $7.5 million. A staggering sum at the time. Most women in her shoes would have spent it on jewels, clothing, and balls, but not Hetty. She took the money, packed up, and headed straight to the beating heart of capitalism, Wall Street. Her Aunt Sylvia died shortly after, and Hetty was the only heir to Sylvia's fortune. But there was a kink in the road. When Sylvia fell ill, her physician helped her write out a new will, which stipulated that the physician would be the trustee of the fortune. The bulk of the inheritance would go to the physician, and a $1 million inheritance would go to Hetty under the management of the physician. Imagine that. Needless to say, Hetty wasn't having it. She spent years in court fighting for her inheritance. The lawsuit went clear to the Massachusetts Supreme Court. Hetty contested this arrangement by presenting what she claimed was an earlier will that left the entire estate to her. However, the court ultimately ruled against her. If you're picturing a glamorous, pearl-draped woman charming the bankers, forget it. Hetty dressed in the same raggedy black dress for years, barely changed her undergarments, and traveled with a single handbag. She hated waste. She refused to turn on the heat in the winter. She ate cold oatmeal to save on heating costs. Instead of owning a luxury home or a mansion, she bounced between cheap apartments and boarding houses in New York and New Jersey. She refused to pay rent higher than $20 a month. Why? Because in her own words, when I can get good accommodations for cheap, why should I spend money foolishly? She believed that fancy living was a waste of time and money. She obsessed over saving money. She once spent an entire night looking for a lost postage stamp. She argued over a 10-cent grocery bill. She traveled miles to buy day-old bread at a discount. She once got into a fight with a laundromat over a 5-cent charge. And she never paid for an office. She worked out of the vault of the banks where she stored her money, sitting on crates instead of renting furniture. And yet, this frugal woman became one of the most feared and respected investors in America. She bought cheap, sold high, and never ever panicked. When everyone else ran from financial crisis, Hetty saw opportunities. During the pandemic of 1873, when businesses collapsed and bankers begged for loans, Hetty had one thing they all needed: cash. While others went bankrupt, she lent money at high interest rates, making millions. By the 1880s, Hetty Green wasn't just rich. She was one of the richest people in the country, male or female. And she did it all on her own. As for her personal life, she met Edward Green at a hotel in Boston in 1864. He fell for her immediately. He was 14 years her senior, and he was already a millionaire. They were engaged in the summer of 1865. Prior to her father's death, he made it clear that she was to marry a man that could manage her money. He also stipulated that her inheritance and money would remain separate from his, free from debts and control of anyone else. In 1867, she married Edward Green. He was not particularly a shrewd businessman, and here's where it gets interesting. Hetty made Edward sign a prenup, almost unheard of at the time. She wanted no man touching her fortune, and when Edward started making risky investments, Hetty cut him off and separated from him. But she did have 2 children, Edward and Sylvia. Sylvia was named after Hetty's aunt on her mother's side, and Edward was nicknamed Ned. You'd think Hetty would shower them with riches, right? Wrong. She raised them just as frugally as she lived. When her son Ned broke his leg, Hetty refused to pay for a doctor, choosing instead to take him to a free clinic for the poor. His leg never healed properly, and he ended up with an amputation. Despite this, Ned remained loyal to his mother. Many historians believe that Hetty Green was the real-life inspiration for Ebenezer Scrooge, which was published by Charles Dickens in 1843. This was prior to Hetty's rise in Wall Street, but later versions of Scrooge did seem to take on characteristics eerily similar to Hetty. She hoarded money like a miser. She was notoriously cold-hearted. She even had a crippled son just like Tiny Tim, except she refused to pay for his medical bills. Newspapers at the time even called her Mrs. Scrooge. She wasn't just shrewd, she was extremely paranoid. She carried a loaded revolver in her purse at all times, in fear of being robbed. She refused to tell anyone where she lived to avoid kidnappers and thieves, which kind of makes sense considering her extreme wealth. She refused to have chauffeurs because she didn't trust their driving skills. When she walked the streets of New York and Manhattan, she looked more like a beggar, but no one dared to mess with her. If they did, she would ruin them financially. Hetty sued a lot of people. She was notorious for being scrappy. If someone owed her money, even a single penny, She would drag them to court and fight tooth and nail to get it back. The Guinness Book of World Records labeled Hetty as the world's greatest miser. One of her longest court battles lasted 20 years, involving a property dispute worth millions. She had no patience for dishonesty and once famously said, "A girl should be as honest as a man, if not more so." Because women were rarely taken seriously in business or finance, Hetty would often use male pseudonyms. She was so successful at it that many men on Wall Street had no idea they were borrowing from a woman. One of her tricks was disguising her voice on the phone or having business done through proxies. Hetty Robin Green was at her most powerful during financial crises. Despite being one of the most powerful financiers of her time, Hetty distrusted Wall Street men. She hated bankers and never trusted politicians. She believed they were greedy and incompetent. Imagine that. And she wasn't afraid to tell them so. One New York banker famously said, "I'd rather face a whole room full of Wall Street sharks than face Hetty Green." He wasn't joking. When banks tried to squeeze her out, she squeezed back, but harder. She once refused to bail out a struggling bank because they had previously insulted her. The bank collapsed soon after. She was known to laugh in the face of men who begged her for loans, often calling them fools for mismanaging their funds. J.P. Morgan feared Hetty's influence, as she often held more liquid cash during financial panics than his own firm. In the panic of 1907, banks were collapsing, businesses were failing, and the U.S. economy was on the brink. Guess who came to the rescue? Not the government, not the big bankers. It was Hetty Green. She lent out millions to keep businesses afloat, making herself an indispensable force in American finance. Some even say she was richer than J.P. Morgan. She was always prepared for a financial crisis, keeping stacks of cash in various safety deposit boxes across New York. She preferred hard cash over stocks. At one point, she kept over $200 million in cash and bonds located away in vaults. She would even carry millions of dollars worth of bonds and checks sewn into the lining of her dress. Some even said she slept with money under her mattress or in a small satchel that she never let out of her sight. She didn't just hoard wealth, she actively controlled markets, bailed out banks, and influenced major financial policies. She owned railroad stocks and bonds, real estate, government bonds, and mortgages, but she avoided partnerships, something unheard of for a woman of those times. Many historians believe at the height of her wealth, she may have been the richest woman in the world, but definitely known as the richest woman in America. By 1916, Hetty was 82 years old and still as sharp as ever, but her frugal nature finally caught up with her. She had a heart attack caused by arguing over the price of skim milk. Even on her deathbed, she refused to pay for a doctor, relying instead on home remedies. By today's standards, she was worth billions, but she fought over pennies until the very end. On July 3rd of 1916, Hetty Green died. She was 82. She left behind an estate worth over 100 to 200 million, equaling 4 to 5 billion today. Her children did not inherit her frugality. Her son, Ned Green, lived extravagantly, collecting diamonds, fast cars, and even a pet kangaroo. He also spent her fortunes on mansions, yachts, and luxuries, the exact opposite of what Hetty stood for. But they were items he was never allowed to have while his mother was alive. Sylvia Green was more reserved, but gave most of her fortune away to charities, universities, and hospitals. By the mid-20th century, the Green family fortune was almost completely wiped out, blown away by lavish spending, bad investments, and generous donations. Hetty spent her entire life hoarding wealth, only for it to disappear within decades. The irony is astounding. And just like that, the Witch of Wall Street was gone. Some called her a miser, others a financial genius. Some said she was heartless, and others said she was ahead of her time. One thing is certain, Hetty Green defied every rule of her era. She built an empire without her husband's help, outwitted the best men on Wall Street, and left behind a fortune that outlived her. Today, the world remembers J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, and Carnegie, but Hetty Green should be right up there with them. Either way, the Witch of Wall Street remains one of the most fascinating figures in American financial history. And that, my friends, is the wild and unbelievable story of Hetty Green. Thanks for watching.